close your eyes and imagine this. You're standing in the middle of an endless grassland 40,000 years ago. There are no cities on the horizon, no farms, no roads, no buildings, just open savanna stretching to the edge of the world. The sun is setting, painting the sky in colours that no photograph could ever capture. And somewhere nearby, a small group of humans is gathering around a fire they've carefully built and maintained all day. These people are your ancestors, direct, unbroken lineage stretching back through hundreds of generations, and flowing through their veins, keeping them alive in a world more dangerous than anything you can imagine, is blood. The same type of blood that might be flowing through your veins right now. Type O. This isn't just a story about biology or genetics. This is about the oldest human bloodline on Earth. The primordial code written in crimson that connects you directly to the very first humans who walked upright, who learned to make fire, who survived when survival should have been impossible. Tonight we're going to trace that bloodline backward through time. And what we're going to discover will change how you think about who you are and where you came from. See, here's something most people don't know. Blood types aren't just random categories doctors use for transfusions. They're evolutionary markers, genetic fingerprints left behind by our ancestors as they struggled and adapted and survived across hundreds of thousands of years. And type O, the blood type carried by nearly half of all humans alive today, is the oldest of them all. It's the original, the first. The blood type that existed before there were different blood types. Before we go further, do me a favour. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly what it's for. So maybe hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you are right now and what time it is. I read them all, and it's wild seeing Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, and Los Angeles at midnight all at once. It's like watching the whole world breathe together. Now, back to our mystery. Scientists have known about blood types for over a century, but only recently have we been able to use sophisticated genetic analysis to date them, to figure out when they first appeared in human populations and why. And what they've discovered about type EO is absolutely stunning. This blood type didn't just exist before modern civilization, it existed before modern humans. Type O was flowing through the veins of our ancestors when they were still figuring out how to be human, when they were developing language, creating the first tools, learning to cooperate in ways no other species ever had. Which raises an incredible question. What secrets does this ancient bloodline hold? What can Type O tell us about human origins, about survival, about the long and desperate journey that brought us from tiny populations clinging to existence in Africa to 8 billion people spread across every corner of the planet? That's what we're here to explore, and the answers are stranger and more fascinating than you might expect. We're going to walk backward through time together. From modern genetics labs where researchers are unlocking the molecular history written in our DNA, all the way back to the African savannas where our earliest ancestors first developed this primordial blood type. We'll witness the Great Migration, when humans carrying Type O in their veins walked out of Africa and spread across the world. We'll stand with Ice Age hunters in frozen Europe, sit with the first farmers as they planted seeds that would change everything, and cross ancient land bridges into the Americas with people whose descendants would maintain the highest concentrations of Type O blood anywhere on Earth. We'll explore how plagues and diseases shaped blood type distribution, how different environments selected for different genetic traits, and how modern medicine is still discovering new secrets about this ancient code we carry inside us. But most importantly, we're going to understand something profound. Every time your heart beats, every time blood moves through your body, you're connected to an unbroken chain of survival, stretching back further than recorded history, further than agriculture, further than civilization itself. If you have Type O blood, you're carrying the oldest human bloodline in existence, The same blood that kept your ancestors alive through ice ages and droughts, through the extinction of countless other species, through climate catastrophes that nearly ended humanity before it really began. And even if you don't have type O, your ancestors did. Somewhere back in your family tree before the genetic mutations that created other blood types, your lineage flowed with this primordial blood. This is where we came from. This is the blood that came before everything else. So let's begin at the beginning with the question that started it all. What exactly is blood type and why does it matter? Before we can understand why type O blood might be humanity's oldest inheritance, we need to understand what blood types actually are. Not the simplified version you learned in high school biology, but the deeper story written in molecular chemistry and immune system evolution. Because blood types aren't just labels doctors use for transfusions. They're genetic markers, timestamps etched into our cells that tell the story of who we were and how we survived. The discovery happened in 1900, which is astonishingly recent when you think about it. For millennia, physicians had been transfusing blood between patients with wildly inconsistent results. Sometimes it worked miraculously, saving lives. Other times, patients died horribly within minutes, their bodies rejecting the foreign blood in ways that seemed completely unpredictable. It was medical roulette, and nobody understood why. Then came Karl Landsteiner, an Austrian physician working in Vienna. He did something remarkably simple. He took blood samples from himself and his colleagues, separated the red blood cells from the plasma, and mixed them together in different combinations. What he saw under the microscope changed medicine forever. Sometimes the red blood cells stayed separate, floating freely in the solution, but other times they clumped together in ugly, deadly aggregates that would have killed a patient if they'd occurred inside living veins. The pattern wasn't random. Certain blood samples always clumped with certain others and always stayed separate from still others. Landsteiner had discovered that human blood came in distinct types, and that these types were fundamentally incompatible with each other. The explanation lies at the molecular level, on the surface of your red blood cells. Each cell is covered with millions of protein and carbohydrate structures called antigens. Think of them as identification badges, molecular flags that tell your immune system this cell belongs here. The ABO blood type system is determined by which of two specific antigens you carry. Type A people have A antigens. Type B people have B antigens. Type AB people have both. And type O, they have neither. Their red blood cells are naked of these particular markers, stripped clean of the antigens that define the other blood types. But here's where it gets interesting. Your blood doesn't just carry antigens on your cells, it also carries antibodies in your plasma. And these antibodies are specifically designed to attack the antigens you don't have. It's like your immune system has learned to recognize and destroy anything that doesn't match your own type. If you're type A, your plasma contains anti-B antibodies, floating weapons ready to attack any B antigens they encounter. If you're type B, you carry anti-A antibodies. Type AB individuals have neither antibody, because attacking either antigen would mean attacking their own cells. And type O people carry both anti-A and anti-B antibodies. Their immune systems are primed to attack both foreign antigens, protecting them against blood that carries either marker. This is why type O individuals can only receive type O blood. Anything else triggers an immediate immune response, those antibodies binding to the foreign antigens and causing the deadly clumping that Landsteiner observed under his microscope. But flip the equation around and something remarkable emerges. If type O blood carries no A or B antigens, then it has nothing for other people's antibodies to attack. A type O red blood cell can slip into a type A, type B, or type AB person's bloodstream without triggering alarm bells. No antigens means no recognition, no attack, no clumping. This makes type O the universal donor. Blood that can save anyone's life in an emergency, when there's no time for testing and cross-matching. The implications are staggering when you think about it from an evolutionary perspective. Type O isn't just another blood type, it's the baseline, the default state. The other blood types are additions, genetic modifications that added new antigens to the red blood cell surface. Type O is what's left when you strip those modifications away. It's humanity's naked blood, unadorned and ancient. Then there's the Rh factor, another layer of complexity discovered decades after Landsteiner's initial breakthrough. The Rh system involves a different antigen, and people either have it, making them Rh positive, or lack it, making them Rh negative. When you combine the two systems, you get 8 common blood types, from A positive to O negative, and the O negative blood, lacking both the A and B antigens and the Rh antigen, becomes the most universal donor of all. It's the blood that emergency rooms pray they have in stock when trauma patients arrive bleeding and unconscious with no time for typing. It's liquid compatibility, blood that almost any human body will accept. But why does this molecular simplicity matter for our story? Because in genetics, simple often means old. Complex traits usually evolve from simpler ones, not the other way around. Mutations add information, create new structures, build complexity on top of existing foundations. When you find a trait that's molecularly simple, stripped down to its bare essentials, you're often looking at something ancient, something that existed before the additions and modifications came along. Type O blood, with its absence of antigens, its molecular nakedness, might be the blood that flowed through our ancestors' veins before the other types emerged. It might be the blood that carried oxygen to the brains of those 1,280 bottleneck survivors as they clung to existence through 117,000 years of climate catastrophe. The blood that sustained the first humans as they walked out of Africa. The blood that came before everything else. And if that's true, then understanding Type O means understanding something profound about human survival, about the biological inheritance that connects us to people who lived before civilization, before agriculture, before written history. We're about to trace that connection back through time, following the genetic evidence to its ultimate source. Here's where the story gets really strange. We know blood type O is ancient, but how ancient? How do you date something that doesn't leave fossils, something that exists only as microscopic differences in the proteins coating your red blood cells? The answer lies in a technique that sounds like science fiction, but is actually just very clever mathematics, molecular clocks. The basic idea is simple, even if the execution is mind-bendingly complex. Your DNA mutates at a relatively predictable rate. Not perfectly regular like clockwork, but consistent enough that scientists can use it to measure time. Think of it like radioactive decay, but instead of atoms breaking down, you're watching genetic letters change. One base pair swapping for another, generation after generation, creating a kind of molecular fossil record written in the language of genetics. Geneticists can compare the DNA sequences between different blood types and count the differences. More differences mean more time has passed since those variants shared a common ancestor. It's like comparing two versions of a text that was copied by hand repeatedly. Each copy introduces small errors, typos, changed words. Compare two copies separated by many generations of copying, and you'll see lots of differences. Compare two recent copies, and you'll see very few. The ABO blood type gene sits on chromosome 9, position 9q34.2 if you want to get technical about it. It's a relatively small piece of genetic code, just over 1,000 base pairs, coding for a protein called a glycosyltransferase. That protein determines what kind of sugar molecules get attached to the surface of your red blood cells. Type O, type A, type B, they're all just variations in how this one gene instructs your cells to decorate themselves. When scientists started applying molecular clock techniques to the ABO gene in the late 1990s, They expected it would be old. What they didn't expect was just how old. The earliest estimates suggested the common ancestor of all modern blood types existed somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago, before modern humans, before Neanderthals, before Homo erectus even finished spreading across the Old World. We're talking about genetic variation that predates our species by hundreds of thousands of years, possibly over 1 million. Your blood type isn't just inherited from your parents or your grandparents. It's inherited from ancestors who weren't even anatomically modern yet, who were just beginning the long evolutionary journey that would eventually produce you. But here's where it gets complicated. Not all geneticists agree on the exact timeline. Some molecular clock studies push the dates back even further, suggesting blood type diversity might extend 3 or even 5 million years into the past. Others argue for more recent origins, maybe only 500,000 years ago. The range of estimates is huge, which tells you this isn't settled science. It's detective work, and the clues are fragmentary at best. The disagreement comes down to assumptions. Molecular clocks don't tick at perfectly regular rates. Mutation rates vary between populations, between different parts of the genome, even between different time periods. You have to make educated guesses about things like generation time. How old were your ancestors when they had children? Population size matters too. Remember that bottleneck? Events like that can accelerate genetic change in unpredictable ways. Still, despite the uncertainty about exact dates, there's broad consensus on the big picture. Type O is old, monumentally old, and most geneticists agree it represents what they call the ancestral state. The original blood type from which A and B evolved later through mutation. The genetic evidence for this is actually pretty straightforward. The type O allele is what geneticists call a null allele. It produces a non-functional protein, a broken enzyme that can't add any sugar molecules to red blood cells. Type A and type B, by contrast, are functional alleles. They produce working enzymes that add specific sugars. In evolutionary terms, going from functional to non-functional is easy. All it takes is one mutation that breaks the gene. But going from non-functional back to functional, that's extraordinarily rare. You'd need multiple specific mutations happening in exactly the right sequence to rebuild a working enzyme. Possible, but so unlikely that geneticists generally assume it didn't happen. So the most parsimonious explanation, the one that requires the fewest evolutionary coincidences, is that there was an original functional blood type gene, probably something like modern type A. At some point, that gene mutated into type O. Later, separate mutations created type B. All 3 versions have been maintained in human populations ever since through a process called balancing selection, where having diversity provides survival advantages to the population as a whole. But recently, ancient DNA has started giving us actual evidence instead of just mathematical models. When scientists successfully extracted and sequenced DNA from Neanderthal bones in the early 2000s, one of the first things they looked for was blood type. What they found was remarkable. Neanderthals had all 3 major blood types, type O, type A, type B, all present in populations that had been separated from our ancestors for over 500,000 years. This tells us something profound. The blood type diversity we see in modern humans isn't something recent. It's not a product of agriculture or civilization. It's ancient variation that was already present in the common ancestor we shared with Neanderthals. Variation that survived the bottleneck, survived the splitting of human lineages, survived hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. The same pattern shows up in Denisovan DNA. Limited samples, just a few individuals, but enough to confirm they too carried multiple blood types. The diversity predates the divergence of all human species. Some researchers have even started looking at blood type genes in other primates. Chimpanzees have their own version of the ABO system, similar but not identical to ours, so do gorillas. This suggests the basic genetic system might be even older than the molecular clocks indicate, possibly dating back to the common ancestor of all great apes, 10 or 15 million years ago. But then you run into a puzzle. If blood type diversity is that ancient, why do we still have it? Natural selection is supposed to eliminate harmful variation and fix beneficial mutations. Given millions of years, you'd expect one blood type to have won out, to have proven so advantageous that it replaced all the others. Instead, we've maintained all three types across millions of years and multiple human species. That persistence demands an explanation, and the only explanation that makes sense is that blood type diversity itself provides advantages, that there's no single best blood type, only types that are better or worse depending on circumstances. Environment, diet, disease, pressures, all of these might favour different blood types at different times and places, which brings us back to type O, the ancestral blood type, the variation that came first and has persisted longer than any other. If we want to understand why type O still dominates so many human populations, we need to understand what advantages it provided. We need to look at the environments where it first evolved, the challenges early humans faced, and how having type O blood might have helped them survive. We need to go back to the Savanna. Picture a world 150,000 years ago, East Africa, somewhere in the region where modern Ethiopia, Kenya and Tanzania meet. The climate has stabilized after the bottleneck, the rains have returned, and the grasslands stretch endlessly under a sky so vast it seems to touch the earth at every horizon. Your ancestors are there, small groups of maybe 20-30 individuals, moving across this landscape with a purpose that looks casual but is anything but. Every decision they make is about survival, where to camp, what to hunt, which water sources are safe, when to move and when to stay. Get it wrong and people die. Get it right and the group lives another season. These weren't the bumbling cavemen of popular imagination. These were sophisticated survivors, descendants of the bottleneck populations who had endured more than any humans before or since. They carried in their genes 117,000 years of evolutionary refinement, adaptations that had been tested against the worst conditions Earth could throw at them, and they carried something else, type O blood. Not just some of them, probably all of them, or close enough that it made no difference. Because when you trace blood type genetics backward through time, when you look at the distribution patterns and calculate mutation rates, everything points to a single conclusion. Type O is the original, the ancestral blood type that existed before the others emerged. Your earliest ancestors, the ones who survived the bottleneck and spread across Africa during the recovery period, they were almost certainly type O. This wasn't random. Blood types aren't just arbitrary labels doctors use for transfusions. They're functional differences in how your body processes the world around you. And type O, it turns out, comes with some interesting characteristics that might have meant the difference between life and death on the ancient savannas. Start with digestion. Type O individuals produce higher levels of stomach acid on average than other blood types. Not massively higher, not enough that you'd notice in daily life, but enough to show up in medical studies. Higher stomach acid means more efficient protein breakdown, faster processing of meat and animal products. Now think about what that means for a hunter-gatherer on the African plains. Your diet is heavily dependent on hunting. Yes, you gather plant foods, and they're important for your survival, absolutely critical during lean seasons. But the calorie-dense, protein-rich foods that keep you strong, that build muscle and fuel your brain, that let you walk 20 miles in a day tracking game, those come from animals. You need to extract every bit of nutrition from every kill, because the next one might be days away. A digestive system optimized for processing meat efficiently. That's not just an advantage. That's the kind of thing that determines which children survive their first hungry season and which don't. The archaeological record backs this up. Early human sites from this period are littered with animal bones, not just from small game, but from massive creatures, ancient elephants, giant buffalo, prehistoric horses. Your ancestors were taking down animals that could kill them easily if the hunt went wrong. They were doing it with stone-tipped spears and raw courage, coordinating in groups, using strategy and communication to overcome prey that outweighed them by thousands of pounds. This was dangerous, exhausting work that required enormous energy expenditure. The groups that could extract maximum nutrition from their kills had an edge. They could hunt more effectively, travel farther, support more children. Over thousands of generations that edge compounds. Natural selection doesn't care about big dramatic differences. It works on margins, on the slightly better adapted out-surviving the slightly less adapted generation after generation, until the advantageous trait becomes dominant. But there might be more to the Type O story than just digestion. Some researchers have suggested that Type O blood provides certain immunological advantages, particularly against some of the parasites and diseases that plagued early human populations. The evidence here is more speculative, less settled than the digestive efficiency data, but it's intriguing. Type O individuals show different susceptibility patterns to various pathogens compared to other blood types. Some diseases hit them harder, others barely touch them. In the specific disease environment of ancient Africa, with its particular mix of parasites, bacterial infections and endemic illnesses, Type O might have provided just enough protection against the most common killers to matter. Malaria, for instance, has been killing humans for tens of thousands of years. The genetic signatures of our adaptations to malaria are written deep in our DNA, and some studies suggest Type O individuals have slightly different malaria susceptibility than other blood types. The effect isn't dramatic, it's not immunity, but in a world where malaria could wipe out half the children in a group before they reached adulthood, even a small reduction in severity could mean survival. Then there's cholera, dysentery, and a host of other waterborne diseases that would have been constant threats to people living close to rivers and lakes. Type O shows different susceptibility patterns to these as well. Again, not immunity, but variations in how the disease progresses, how severe it becomes. In the margins where survival is decided, these small differences accumulate. The landscape itself was shaping blood type distribution through environmental pressure. Groups that stayed near reliable water sources faced different disease challenges than groups that ranged widely across drier territories. Populations that specialized in hunting large game had different nutritional pressures than those who relied more heavily on fishing or gathering. But all of them started with Type O. All of them carried the ancestral blood type that had emerged from the bottleneck. What happened next depended on where they went and what challenges they faced. Some populations would remain almost exclusively Type O for tens of thousands of years. Others, as they encountered new environments and new selection pressures, would eventually develop the mutations that created Type A, Type B, and eventually Type AB. But that was still far in the future. For now, for these hunters on the ancient Savanna, Type O was universal. It was the blood that flowed through the veins of every successful human group in Africa, the blood that sustained them through long hunts and longer droughts, the blood that processed the meat that built their muscles and fueled their increasingly large brains, the blood that maybe, just maybe, helped them resist diseases that would have wiped out populations with different immunological profiles. They didn't know any of this, of course. They didn't know about blood types or stomach acid or evolutionary selection pressures. They just lived, hunted, raised their children, and tried to survive another season. But inside them, written in the chemistry of their blood, was a legacy of survival that stretched back through the bottleneck to the very origins of their species. And they were about to take that legacy on a journey. because some of these typo children of the Savanna were growing restless, looking at the horizons, wondering what lay beyond the territories their ancestors had known for hundreds of thousands of years. The world was wide and empty, recovering from ancient disasters, waiting to be populated, and they were ready to walk. Around 70,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. A small group of humans, maybe just a few hundred individuals, stood at the edge of Africa and looked out across the narrow waters separating their continent from Arabia. They had no idea they were about to change the world. They were just looking for food, following game animals, searching for new territories where resources might be more abundant. But in their veins flowed the ancient signature, Type O blood, the original human bloodline that had survived the bottleneck, weathered the climate disasters, and carried humanity through its darkest hours. These weren't the first humans to leave Africa. Earlier groups had ventured out, maybe 130,000 years ago, but they died out, failed to establish permanent populations. This time would be different. This time, the migrants carried something their predecessors lacked. They carried the full package of survival adaptations refined over hundreds of thousands of years. Better tools, more sophisticated social organization, enhanced cognitive abilities, and crucially, they carried Type O blood in frequencies we can still detect in their descendants today. The crossing itself probably wasn't dramatic. During ice ages, sea levels drop dramatically as water gets locked up in glaciers. The Red Sea narrows, islands appear. What seems impossible during warm periods becomes almost easy when the world freezes. They might have island hopped, moving from one temporary landmass to another. They might have built simple rafts. Or maybe they just waded through shallows during an extreme low tide, carrying children on their shoulders, tools and supplies wrapped in animal skins. But once across, they found themselves in a new world. The Arabian Peninsula 70,000 years ago wasn't the desert we know today. During ice ages, Arabia becomes surprisingly green. Rainfall patterns shift, lakes form, grasslands spread across regions that now nothing but sand. The migrants walked into this fertile landscape and thrived. Within a few thousand years, their descendants had spread across the entire Middle East, establishing populations from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf. Here's where genetics tells us something fascinating. Analysis of ancient DNA and modern populations suggests these founding groups carried extremely high frequencies of Type O blood. Some estimates put it above 90%. This makes sense when you think about the bottleneck history. Type O is the ancestral blood type, the default setting that emerged before the mutations creating A and B came along. Small founding populations drawn from African groups where Type O dominated would naturally carry those frequencies with them. But there's another factor. The migration itself created a series of secondary bottlenecks. Each time a small group split off to explore new territory, they carried only a fraction of the genetic diversity from the parent population. If the migrants happened to be predominantly Type O, which genetic drift could easily produce in small groups, then the new population would be even more Type O dominant. It's like copying a document repeatedly. Each generation of copies emphasizes whatever characteristics were strongest in the template. The migrants didn't stop in Arabia. They kept moving, following river valleys, tracking animal migrations, always searching for the next good territory. One group turned east, following the coastline of the Indian Ocean. Archaeological sites along this route show a distinctive pattern of shell middens, massive piles of discarded seashells marking ancient campsites. These people were living off the ocean, harvesting shellfish and fishing, skills that let them move incredibly fast along productive coastlines. Within maybe 10,000 years, these coastal migrants had reached Southeast Asia. Within 20,000 years, they'd reached Australia. Think about that timeline. from Africa to Australia in less time than separates us from the end of the last ice age. They were travelling light, adapting quickly, exploiting coastal resources that required relatively simple technology, but provided abundant calories. And everywhere they went, they carried Type O blood in dominant frequencies. Modern Indigenous Australian populations show some of the highest Type O percentages in the world, often exceeding 95%. This isn't random. It's the genetic signature of those ancient coastal migrants, preserved in populations that remained relatively isolated for tens of thousands of years. Other groups went north and west, spreading across Europe and Asia. These migrations were slower, more complex. The territories were already occupied by other human species, Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia. Competition for resources was fierce, but the modern human migrants had advantages: more sophisticated tools, better long-range weapons, enhanced capacity for symbolic thinking and social organization. Slowly, over tens of thousands of years, they displaced or absorbed the existing populations. The genetic evidence shows interbreeding. Modern Europeans carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. Modern Asians carry similar amounts plus additional Denisovan genes. But the blood type patterns suggest the migrant groups maintain their Type O dominance even while absorbing genes from other human species. Type O remained the default, the ancestral condition that new mutations modified, but never completely replaced. The most remarkable migration came last. Around 20,000 years ago, during the peak of the last ice age, sea levels dropped so low that a land bridge emerged between Asia and North America. 1,000 miles wide in places, this wasn't a narrow crossing. It was an entire subcontinent, complete with its own ecosystems, plants and animals. Geologists call it Beringia. For the people who lived there, it was home. Small groups of Asian hunters, following mammoth and bison herds, gradually moved across Beringia. They weren't trying to discover a new continent, they were just following food. But once they reached Alaska, they found the way south blocked by massive glaciers covering most of North America. For maybe 5,000 years, they waited in Alaska and Beringia, living in this frozen refuge, their populations slowly adapting to extreme cold. Then, around 15,000 years ago, the glaciers began retreating. A corridor opened between the ice sheets, following roughly where the Rocky Mountains stand today. The migrants poured south into the richest, most abundant environment humans had ever encountered. Ice Age America was paradise. Massive herds of now extinct megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, camels, horses. No major predators capable of threatening organized human hunters, and critically, no other human populations competing for resources. The expansion southward was explosive. Within maybe 2,000 years, human populations had reached the southern tip of South America. They'd covered 2 continents, adapting to every environment from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, and genetic analysis shows these founding groups carried extraordinary Type O dominance. Before European contact, some indigenous American populations showed Type O frequencies approaching 100%. No Type A, no Type B, just the ancient bloodline preserved in its purest form. Why such extreme Type O dominance? Part of it was the multiple bottlenecks, small founding groups establishing new populations again and again. Part of it was isolation. These populations had no contact with African or Eurasian groups where A and B mutations had arisen and spread, but part of it might have been natural selection. Type O blood carries certain advantages in environments with specific disease pressures, in populations without agriculture, without dense settlements, without the crowd diseases that would later devastate humanity. Type O simply worked well enough that no strong selection pressure favoured the newer variants. By 10,000 years ago, humans carrying predominantly Type O blood had reached every habitable continent, from the Australian outback to Patagonia, from Siberia to South Africa. The descendants of those African survivors had spread across the planet. They'd walked further than any mammal species had ever migrated. They'd adapted to more extreme environments than any other primate, and in their veins flowed the blood that had carried humanity through bottlenecks, climate disasters, and the longest journey in history. The ancient code still beating strong, ready for whatever came next. Picture the continent of Europe 40,000 years ago. Not the gentle, forested landscape you might imagine, but something far harsher. A world of bitter cold and crushing glaciers, vast ice sheets extending south from Scandinavia, sometimes reaching as far as modern-day Germany and Poland. Between the glaciers, open tundra stretched for hundreds of miles, frozen ground, sparse vegetation, winds that could kill you in hours if you weren't prepared. This was the world that humans decided to colonize, and they didn't just survive there, they thrived. The people who moved into Ice Age Europe weren't stumbling into unknown territory unprepared. They were the descendants of African survivors who had already proven themselves against impossible odds. They carried with them technologies refined over hundreds of thousands of years, fire management sophisticated enough to keep them warm through 6-month winters, clothing made from animal skins, carefully sewn with bone needles, weapons capable of bringing down creatures that weighed several tons, and they carried something else too. The blood that had kept their ancestors alive through the worst climate disasters in human history. Type O blood, the universal donor, the ancient baseline that had emerged when humanity itself was forged in crisis. But they weren't alone in Europe. The Neanderthals had been there for hundreds of thousands of years already. They had adapted to Ice Age conditions in ways that made them perfectly suited to this brutal environment. Massive barrel chests for processing cold air, stocky, muscular builds that conserved heat, brains actually larger than those of the modern humans who are now arriving from Africa and the Middle East. And here's where things get fascinating. We can now extract DNA from Neanderthal remains. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to ask questions that would have seemed like science fiction just a few decades ago. Questions like, what blood types did Neanderthals have? The answer is complicated but tantalizing. Neanderthal DNA shows evidence of all the major blood group systems, ABO, Rh, and others. They had genetic variants that correspond to type O, type A, possibly type B, though the evidence there is less clear. What this tells us is profound. The fundamental blood type system that humans carry today, the ABO groups that determine who can donate to whom, existed before modern humans and Neanderthals split into separate species. It goes back at least 800,000 years, probably much further. The Neanderthals you would have encountered in Ice Age Europe could have been type O, just like many of the modern humans arriving from Africa. Now imagine what happened when these two human species met. Not as enemies necessarily, though there was probably competition and conflict, but also as potential partners, allies, maybe even lovers. The genetic evidence is absolutely clear on this point. Modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, multiple times, in multiple places over thousands of years. If you're of European or Asian descent, you carry Neanderthal DNA. Probably between 1 and 4% of your genome came from these stocky, cold-adapted Ice Age survivors. But here's something most people never consider. When modern humans and Neanderthals had children together, those children inherited blood from both parents. A type O modern human mother and a type A Neanderthal father could produce children with either blood type. Over generations, as these hybrid populations grew and spread, they would have been mixing not just genetic material from two species, but potentially different blood type frequencies as well. Some researchers have suggested that certain Neanderthal blood group variants might have provided advantages in the European environment: better resistance to specific diseases, improved ability to process certain foods, enhanced immune responses to local pathogens. If so, natural selection would have favoured the children who inherited these beneficial blood variants, even if they came from their Neanderthal parent. We can't prove this yet. The ancient DNA is too degraded, the genetic analysis too complex. But it's a reminder that blood types aren't just static labels. They're part of living, evolving biological systems that responded to real environmental challenges. And Ice Age Europe presented challenges unlike anything humans had faced before. The people living in these frozen landscapes were hunting animals that would terrify us today. Woolly mammoths, 15 feet tall at the shoulder, covered in thick fur and protected by massive curved tusks. Cave bears larger than modern grizzlies. Woolly rhinoceros, cave lions, giant elk with antlers spanning 12 feet. These weren't animals you could chase down and kill with simple weapons. They required planning, coordination, sophisticated technology, and raw courage. Archaeological sites across Europe show evidence of systematic mammoth hunting. Not just scavenging already dead animals, but actively tracking and killing these enormous creatures. At some sites, researchers have found the remains of dozens of mammoths, killed and butchered by human hunters over many generations. Could blood type have played any role in this? It's speculation, but interesting speculation. Type O individuals tend to have certain physiological characteristics that might, possibly, have been advantageous for Ice Age hunters. Some studies suggest enhanced ability to process high-protein, high-fat diets, exactly the kind of diet you'd get from hunting large mammals, better stress response under certain conditions, enhanced physical endurance in some populations. None of this is definitive. Blood type isn't destiny, and individual variation matters far more than group averages. But in a world where the difference between eating and starving could come down to whether you had the stamina to track a wounded mammoth for 3 days across frozen tundra, even small physiological advantages might matter. The people who survived Ice Age Europe, whether they were Type O or Type O Abe, or carried Neanderthal blood variants or purely modern human ones, they left us something precious. Not just their genes, but their art, deep in caves across France, Spain, and other parts of Europe. These Ice Age survivors painted images that still take our breath away 30,000 years later. The walls of Lascaux Cave in France, covered with bulls, horses, and deer, painted with such skill and vitality they seem ready to leap off the stone. The Chauvet Cave, with its hunting scenes and handprints, its charging rhinoceros and pride of lions. Altamira in Spain, where bison painted in red and black ochre used the natural contours of the cave ceiling to create an illusion of three-dimensional movement. Someone painted those images, individual human beings with Type O blood or Type A or hybrid Neanderthal variants flowing through their veins. People who survived on mammoth meat through endless winters. People who gave birth in Ice Age darkness and raised children who would become hunters and artists themselves. They painted by the light of animal fat lamps, mixing pigments from red ochre and black manganese, sometimes blowing paint through hollow bones to create a spray effect. They were creating the first human art galleries, decorating their world with images of the animals they hunted and the forces they couldn't control. Then, gradually, the ice began to retreat. Not quickly, not steadily, but over thousands of years, the glaciers pulled back north. Forests began replacing tundra. The mammoth herds dwindled and disappeared. The cave bears went extinct. The world that had shaped these Ice Age warriors was transforming into something new. And the people living in Europe would have to transform too. The age of hunting was ending. The age of farming was about to begin, and the agricultural revolution would change blood type distribution across the entire continent in ways nobody could have predicted. When the ice finally began to retreat for good and the great herds shifted their ancient routes, another kind of change was quietly gathering strength. Not a sudden disaster this time, but a slow revolution. A revolution in how humans ate, how they lived, how they died, and how their blood was tested by a brand new world. For hundreds of thousands of years, your Type O ancestors had thrived as hunters, foragers, fishers. Bodies tuned to meat, wild plants, long walks, sudden sprints, feast and famine. Then, around 10,000 BCE, in a narrow band of land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, people did something truly unnatural for our species. They stopped moving. The Fertile Crescent was different from most places on Earth. Winters and summers were predictable enough. Rainfall came in patterns. Wild grasses like einkorn and emmer wheat grew in dense stands, so thick that a single day's harvest could feed a band for weeks. Goats and sheep clustered in manageable herds, not scattered across endless plains like the great antelopes of Africa. Somewhere in that landscape, a few families tried an experiment. Instead of wandering to find the food, what if they brought the food to them? They began to save seeds from the best plants and scatter them near their camps. They captured wild goats that didn't bolt at the sight of humans and penned them with crude stone walls. They noticed that if you stayed in one place long enough, the valley itself started to remember you. Fields responded to care. Animals learned your paths. Food could be planned instead of chased. From an evolutionary perspective, this was madness. Under hunting and gathering, failure meant moving on. Under farming, failure meant staying put and starving where you stood. A bad season, a swarm of insects, a disease in the wheat, and your entire village could disappear. Yet the people of the Fertile Crescent persisted, refined, and improved, and over generations the experiment worked. Grain yields increased, herds grew more docile. Babies had a slightly better chance of surviving, not just in good times, but in average times. This was the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution, the shift from a world dominated by mobile bands of hunter-gatherers to one increasingly filled with villages, fields, and eventually cities. And as lifestyles changed, the invisible politics of blood began to shift as well. Type O blood, the old hunter's blood, had ruled the genetic landscape for ages. In many regions, especially among ancient foragers, it appears to have been overwhelmingly common. But with farming came new diets, new diseases, new social structures, and, according to some researchers, a new winner in the genetic game, Type A. Not everyone agrees on the timing, but one influential idea goes like this. In populations that took up cereal agriculture early, wheat and barley in the Fertile Crescent, later rice in East Asia, Type A may have had subtle advantages. Its interactions with the immune system, gut flora and clotting, could have fit the farmer's life a little better than Type O's hardwired hunter physiology. Imagine what changed inside a body when people swapped roasted meat and wild tubers for bowls of porridge and bread. Instead of protein spikes followed by long stretches of activity, farmers lived on a baseline of carbohydrates, grain gruel in the morning, flatbread at midday, perhaps a little goat milk or lentils. Meat became an occasional luxury for many, not a constant. The human digestive system is flexible, but evolution is picky. Tiny differences that didn't matter on the savanna might start to matter in a grain field. How quickly you absorbed sugars, how your blood vessels responded to constant low-level inflammation from new plant proteins, how your immune system reacted to crowded, pathogen-rich villages. Some studies suggest that Type A individuals may have had a slight edge dealing with the kinds of infections and stresses that came with denser settlements, chronic exposure to certain bacteria, repetitive minor injuries, poor sanitation. Others propose that Type O, so good at mounting fierce immune responses, may have sometimes overshot in this new environment, with higher risks of severe reactions to certain infections or nutrient imbalances when diets shifted heavily towards cereals. If those differences affected survival even a little, just a few more children reaching adulthood in Type A families, then over centuries the numbers would tilt. Grain fields would quietly become Type A territory. As farming spread out of the Fertile Crescent, carried by migrations and by imitation, those subtle genetic tides went with it. Villages sprang up in Anatolia, then in the Balkans, then across Europe. Archaeologists can trace this expansion in pottery styles, house designs, grain remains, and animal bones. Geneticists see another pattern layered on top, waves of incoming farmers mingling with older hunter-gatherer bands. Wherever this mixing happened, something interesting tends to appear in the blood. Type O, strong among the older foragers, begins to drop in frequency as early farming lineages, likely richer in Type A and later Type B, take root and grow. Not everywhere, not all at once, but again and again the same general pattern. The plough arrives, the village grows, the foragers retreat or are absorbed, and the blood map changes. Yet diet was only half the story. The other half lived in the pens just outside those early villages. Domesticated animals were not just walking larders, they were biological factories. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, dogs, all shedding hair, skin flakes and parasites, all exhaling, excreting, and bleeding new combinations of microbes into cramped human spaces. Suddenly your ancestors weren't just sharing their huts with siblings and cousins. They were sharing them with fleas, lice, worms, and viruses that had never before had such easy access to human bodies. Sedentary life added another layer. Waste accumulated. Water sources near settlements became contaminated. People slept closer together, breathed each other's air, coughed on each other's children. Pathogens that would have burned out quickly in a tiny scattered band could now circulate endlessly in a crowded village. This is where blood types became more than quirks of transfusion compatibility. Certain pathogens interact differently with different ABO types. Some bacteria latch more easily to Type O cells. Some parasites thrive better in Type A or B environments. Malaria, cholera, smallpox, even later pandemics like plague and influenza, many of them show biases, slight tilts in who gets sickest, who dies fastest, who walks away. We don't know the exact pathogen landscape in those first Neolithic villages, but we can be fairly sure of one thing. It was brutal. Childhood mortality was high. Infections were constant. Under those conditions, any small edge tied to blood type could echo loudly over generations. If Type A helped some farmers resist a particular bowel disease common in grain-eating communities, their children would carry that advantage. If Type O made you more vulnerable to severe dehydration, under constant diarrheal infections but slightly better at fighting another kind of parasite, the balance between those forces would sculpt the gene pool village by village, valley by valley. Meanwhile, not everyone signed up for this agricultural experiment. On the fringes of the new farming world, older ways of life persisted. In the forests of Europe, the highlands of the Near East, the steppes and coasts and deserts that were poorly suited to wheat or barley, hunter-gatherers watched the farmers from a distance. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they raided, sometimes they intermarried. Often they simply moved away, deeper into the lands the plough could not easily tame. These edge populations, clinging to mobile lifestyles, likely preserved higher frequencies of Type O. Their lives still revolved around wild game and scattered plant foods. Their camps were small, their contacts more limited, their disease ecology closer to the ancient pattern, acute infections that flared and vanished, fewer chronic settlement-driven plagues. In them, the old blood held its line. Over millennia, a patchwork emerged. river valleys thick with fields and villages, where type A and later type B often grew more common, forests, mountains and coasts where foragers and pastoralists, people moving with herds or hunting along migration routes, kept older genetic signatures alive, including robust reservoirs of type O. The Neolithic revolution didn't erase the hunter's blood. It challenged it, surrounded it, mixed with it, and redirected it. Type O, forged in the fires of ancient climate catastrophe and sharpened by ages of pursuit and survival, now had to share the stage with newer patterns of life and newer balances of risk and reward. Farming changed almost everything about how humans lived on the surface of the earth. Under the skin, deep in the silent chemistry of blood, it was changing everything too. But while fields spread and villages grew, one vast region of the planet remained untouched by wheat, barley, cows, or goats. Across an ocean, far from the Fertile Crescent's first experiments, type O would soon find its greatest stronghold. By the time our species reached the far edge of the world, the rules of the game had changed again. Imagine this. Tens of thousands of years after that little band of humans walked out of Africa, their descendants were still moving, still following coastlines, rivers, and game trails into places no human eyes had ever seen. Asia, then Siberia, then a narrow, frozen land bridge that briefly linked two continents that are now oceans apart. And those travellers carried their genes with them, including one very old, very stubborn piece of biology, blood type O. When geneticists started looking seriously at blood types in indigenous peoples of the Americas in the 20th century, they found something astonishing. Not just a lot of type O, not just more O than A or B. In many groups, it was effectively universal. Village after village, nation after nation, test after test, type O. In some communities, every single person sampled shared the same basic ABO blood type. No A, no B, almost no AB. On a planet where blood type distributions usually look like patchwork quilts, a dominant here, B common there, O scattered everywhere like background radiation, the pre-Columbian Americas were different. They were a stronghold, a fortress of type O. How did that happen? To answer that, you have to picture the peopling of the Americas not as a mass migration, but as a narrow funnel, a genetic bottleneck inside a bottleneck. Somewhere in northeastern Asia, a small subset of the already small out-of-Africa population began drifting north and east. Those people already had high levels of type O. In many non-African populations, O had become common thanks to earlier selection events, especially resistance to certain severe infections. By the time those ancestors reached Beringia, the now submerged landmass that once bridged Siberia and Alaska, chance had already stacked the deck. This is where founder effects come in. Take a huge, genetically diverse population and form a new group from just a handful of individuals. Whatever traits those founders happen to carry by luck will define the new population. If, say, most of them have type O, then the new group will be overwhelmingly type O, not because O is better, but because that's what they brought with them. Now add time. Thousands of years possibly of people living in Beringia, and then slowly filtering into the Americas as the ice sheets retreated and new routes opened. Diets changed, pathogens changed. The population remained relatively small at first. Under those conditions, genetic drift, random fluctuations in gene frequencies from one generation to the next, starts to matter a lot more than it does in big, dense populations. Drift is like rolling dice for your genes. In small groups, the dice rolls are loud. A rare variant can vanish in a few generations by sheer chance. A common one can become universal. If A or B was already rare in those ancestral groups, each generation of births and deaths pushed them a little further toward the edge of extinction. O, already abundant, grew closer and closer to fixation. Some researchers think selection helped push in the same direction. Certain old-world pathogens that seem to favour or spare particular blood types simply weren't present in the Americas before European contact. The elaborate dance between cholera and type O, or between smallpox and type A, was an old-world drama. On the American stage, the cast of infectious diseases was different. Whatever slight advantages A and B might have once offered elsewhere may have mattered less here. In some ecological niches, they might even have been a liability. Over thousands of years, that combination, founder effect, drift, and possibly mild selection, turned a migrant population that was probably mostly O into something close to only O in many regions. By the time agriculture rose independently in Mesoamerica and the Andes, crops were being planted, cities were being built, and gods were being worshipped by people whose blood, almost to a person, belonged to that most ancient of ABO lineages. And look at what they did with it. Type O doesn't tell you how to build a city. It doesn't whisper architecture into your bones. But it travelled silently through the veins of some of the most sophisticated civilizations the Western Hemisphere would ever see. In the lowland jungles and highland ridges of what is now Mexico and Central America, the Maya carved stepped pyramids from stone and wrapped their calendar around the stars. In the central Mexican plateau, the Mexica, better known as the Aztec, raised Tenochtitlan from a lake, crisscrossed with canals and causeways, markets overflowing, temples piercing the sky. Further south, along the spine of the Andes, the Inca knit mountains together with roads and rope bridges, terracing impossible slopes, turning high altitudes into fields of maize and potatoes. And beyond those imperial names, there were hundreds of other nations, the Mississippian mound builders along the great rivers of North America, the sophisticated trading cultures of the Pacific Northwest, their economies humming on salmon and cedar, the vast networks of the Amazon basin, where recent research suggests intricate systems of managed forests and earthworks that defy the old myth of a pristine, untouched jungle. Different languages, different gods, different ways of life. Hunter-gatherers, farmers, fishers, urban elites, nomadic traders. Yet beneath all that diversity, one quiet commonality. Overwhelmingly, their blood typed as O. Isolation helped preserve this pattern. For tens of thousands of years after the Americas were settled, there were no new waves of migration bringing in fresh A and B alleles from Eurasia or Africa. The oceans were walls, no Bronze Age traders, no steppe horsemen, no Silk Road caravans, just the slow, local circulation of people and genes within the continents themselves. In the Old World, population streams from different regions continually mixed. Farmers from the Near East met hunter-gatherers in Europe. Steppe nomads swept into India and the Middle East. Every encounter shuffled the genetic deck, mixing blood-type frequencies into new patterns. In the Americas, the deck stayed largely in the same hands. Local variations developed, of course. No continent-wide population is truly uniform, but compared to Eurasia, the ABO map of the pre-Columbian Americas was strikingly simple. Type O ruled. That simplicity came with a hidden cost. When European ships finally crossed the Atlantic in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they did not just bring steel, gunpowder, and new crops. They brought diseases that had been evolving for millennia in the crowded cities and tangled trade routes of the Old World. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Pathogens that had danced with blood types A, B, and O for countless generations, honing their strategies, probing weaknesses. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had never met these specific enemies. Their immune systems had faced different challenges: local parasites, regional infections, environmental stresses. They had no inherited memory of smallpox's tricks, no genetic echo of plague. Some scientists have speculated that near-universal type O may have influenced how these new pathogens behaved in American bodies. Type O can be more susceptible to certain severe infections, more resistant to others. In the Old World, the presence of multiple blood types created a complex battlefield. In a population that is almost entirely O, the battlefield is more uniform. A disease well adapted to exploit type O blood might, in theory, spread more efficiently. Whether blood type was a major factor or just one of many small contributing details, the outcome is not in doubt. Epidemics tore through societies that had never seen them before. In some areas, mortality was catastrophic, tearing apart the social fabrics that had woven together for centuries. Cities emptied, fields went untilled, oral histories remember waves of sickness as world-ending events. It is one of the darker ironies of human history. The same isolation that preserved a unique genetic pattern that allowed type O to become nearly universal also meant that when the walls finally came down, the impact was devastating. Yet even here, in the middle of loss, the story of type O in the Americas points back to something deeper and quieter, our shared origins. Because when you strip away the legends and the borders, the blood moving through the hearts of a Maya astronomer, an Inca engineer, a Haudenosaunee diplomat, a Mexica poet, was part of the same ancient lineage that once pulsed through hunter-gatherers on African savannas. The same fundamental architecture, the same fused chromosome, the same old resilient type O variant that had helped their remote ancestors survive parasites and plagues long before any human had imagined a pyramid or a city. The Americas did not invent type O. They preserved it, amplified it, turned it into a continental chorus while the rest of the world played a more complicated chord. And that, in a way, is the quiet message written in their blood. Human diversity is astonishing on the surface, different languages, different cultures, different faces, but underneath, the patterns of our genes keep pointing back to a small, frightened population clinging to life in some ancient refuge. The type O stronghold of the Indigenous Americas is not evidence of separation. It is evidence of connection. A distant echo of that original bottleneck carried halfway around the world, crystallized by chance and history into a single simple fact. Across two vast continents, at the end of the human migration story, the oldest of our common bloodlines was still flowing strong. By the time your ancestors were spreading across continents, carrying their type O blood into forests, grasslands, coasts, and ice fields, they weren't just navigating terrain. They were navigating an invisible landscape of microbes, bacteria, viruses, parasites, tiny predators that didn't stalk from the shadows, but slipped quietly into lungs and intestines and bloodstreams, and your blood type, that simple letter on a medical bracelet, was one of the signals those predators learned to read. Most people think of blood types as a hospital problem, something doctors care about when they give you a transfusion, something you write on a form and then forget. But to evolution, blood types are more like flags, chemical signposts on the surface of your red blood cells and your gut lining, tiny sugar molecules that whisper to invading microbes, "You're welcome here," or "keep out." Over tens of thousands of years, different diseases learn to exploit different flags. Some microbes latch more easily onto type A cells, others do better with type B, and some, unfortunately, find type O a particularly easy target. Natural selection watched all of this unfold, not with intention, but with brutal arithmetic. Outbreak after outbreak, the people who happened to have the wrong flag in the wrong place, at the wrong time, died more often. The survivors passed on whatever flags had helped them endure. So the map of human blood types that exist today is not random. It's a fossil record of epidemics that never wrote their names in stone, only in the frequencies of A, B, AB, and O. Take cholera. For most of human history, rivers and wells were both lifeline and lottery. You would drink, and maybe you would be fine. Or maybe you would swallow a microscopic spiral of bacteria that would tear your body apart from the inside. In the great cholera pandemics of the last few centuries, entire cities watched people go from healthy to dead in a single day. When scientists started looking more closely, they found something chilling. In places where cholera was raging, people with type O blood weren't just getting sick more often, they were dying more often. The toxins produced by the cholera bacterium bind differently depending on the sugars decorating your cells. In type O individuals, those toxins can attach more efficiently, triggering more severe fluid loss, more violent diarrhea, more rapid collapse, generation after generation. In regions where cholera became an unwelcome recurring visitor, that mattered. Type O individuals were more likely to die before they had children, or lose more children when the disease swept through, slowly, very slowly, in villages that lived and died by the river. The proportion of type O began to fall compared to its levels in populations spared from cholera's worst. Not everywhere, and not absolutely, because no disease works with perfect precision, but enough that you can still see the fingerprint today. In some parts of the world, particularly where waterborne diseases like cholera have been relentless, type O is less common than you might expect from chance alone. But the story flips when you shift your gaze. Now picture medieval Europe, long before microscopes, long before anyone understood what a bacterium even was. The Great Plagues arrive like storms from nowhere. The Black Death in the 14th century, then waves of lesser-known outbreaks in the centuries that followed. Buboes swelling in armpits and groins, fevers climbing, cities emptying. In some places, a third of the population disappears in a few months, in others half. Did blood type matter? Did blood? We can't go back and measure the victims, but we can look at what was left behind. Some researchers have suggested that the high frequency of type O in parts of Western Europe might reflect survival during plague years, not because O is universally good, but because the pathogens that happen to thrive in those cramped, unsanitary, flea-ridden towns might have preferred other blood types just a little more. It's a quiet theory, almost a whisper beneath the louder noise of history. Maybe people with certain blood types were more likely to mount effective immune responses to plague bacteria. Maybe the clotting differences associated with ABO types influenced who survived septic shock. Maybe type, with its simpler surface markers, presented fewer convenient handles for some of those medieval microbes to grab. We don't know for sure. Plague was so lethal, so fast and so indiscriminate that any advantage would have been small. But when diseases strike across centuries, even a small advantage adds up. A percentage point here, a percentage point there. A few extra children surviving in one village, a few fewer in another. Over 500 years, that can tilt the balance. Far from the cold stone streets of plague-era Europe, another invisible war was underway in the tropics. This one was fought not in the lungs or intestines, but inside the red blood cells themselves. Malaria. For early farmers and foragers in equatorial regions, malaria was not a rare catastrophe. It was a constant background presence, a drumbeat of fevers, chills, and childhood deaths. Mosquitoes carried plasmodium parasites from person to person, and those parasites learned to dance with human blood. Here, blood type became part of a much more intricate story. Malaria doesn't simply kill or spare based on a single flag. It shapes entire genetic landscapes. In many malarial regions, you see the rise of strange and painful mutations. Sickle cell trait, thalassemias, G6PD deficiency, genetic changes that are harmful in some forms but protective in others. These are the classic examples of balancing selection. Genes that are bad for individuals in some combinations, but useful enough in others that evolution refuses to let them go. The ABO system is woven into this pattern. Some studies suggest that people with type O are less likely to develop the most severe cerebral forms of malaria, perhaps because their red blood cells are less prone to clumping together under the parasite's influence. Others point to different species of malaria parasites that seem to prefer certain blood types, gaining easier entry or better survival in A or B individuals, so you end up with a patchwork. In one region, the particular mix of mosquitoes, parasites, and other genes might favour type O. In another, a different combination might protect type A or B carriers slightly more. Over thousands of years, those tiny differences sculpt blood type frequencies the way wind sculpts sand dunes. Not in a single, simple pattern, but in complex ripples, shifting with every storm. And it wasn't just cholera, plague and malaria making these choices. Smallpox stalked dense settlements, burning its scars, literal and genetic, into populations across Europe, Asia, and later the Americas. Typhoid lurked in contaminated food and water, cutting down young adults in their prime. Dysentery, influenza, measles, and dozens of forgotten fevers moved along trade routes and through armies, testing every aspect of the human immune system. Some of these pathogens showed clear preferences. Certain ABO types have been linked to higher or lower risk of smallpox infection, or different responses to typhoid toxins. Others may have left fainter traces, advantages so subtle that only when you zoom out across continents and centuries do they become visible as slight skews in blood type frequencies. Each epidemic was like another round of a grim lottery, with the winning ticket printed not in ink but in sugars and proteins on the surfaces of your cells. And yet, despite all of this, no single blood type ever won outright. Type O never vanished in cholera zones. Type A never took over all of Europe. Type B never dominated every malarial region. A B, rare and complex, persisted even though it seems to combine many of the susceptibilities of A and B. Why? Because evolution isn't trying to find the best blood type. It's juggling trade-offs. This is the essence of balancing selection. A trait that is harmful in one context might be helpful in another. A blood type that makes you more vulnerable to cholera might also protect you from severe malaria. A type that slightly increases your risk of one infection might reduce your risk of another, or alter your chances of blood clots, or influence your immune response in ways that don't show up until a completely different pathogen arrives. Add to that the randomness of history, who migrated where, which diseases hit first, which populations interbred, and you get a dynamic equilibrium, a constantly shifting balance in which no single type becomes perfect and none are useless enough to disappear. The result is the world we see today, where your blood type is not a verdict, but a story. A record of which diseases your ancestors met, which ones they survived, and which invisible battles quietly shaped the chances that you would ever be born. When you look at your own blood type, O, AB or AB, you're not just looking at a medical label, you're looking at the echo of pandemics long past, at choices made not by kings and generals but by microbes and molecules. And for type O, that ancient bloodline that walked out of Africa and faced down ice, famine and infection, every outbreak was another test, another refinement, another reason it persists today in such high numbers, not because it was always safest, but because, across the long tangled history of disease and destiny, it was often just good enough to see its carriers through to the next sunrise. If you could drain the world of colour for a moment and see only blood types, the planet wouldn't look uniform. It wouldn't be a smooth wash of red. It would be a patchwork, islands of almost pure type O, swirls of A and B overlapping like weather systems, sharp gradients where one type fades and another rises, as if some invisible wind had been blowing genes across the landscape for tens of thousands of years. Type O is the oldest of the common blood types we know, but age doesn't mean sameness. It doesn't mean that every place on Earth carries it in equal measure. Instead, what we see is a global mosaic, a pattern stitched together by migration, isolation, survival, and sometimes pure genetic luck. Nowhere is that more obvious than in the Indigenous Americas. If you could stand at the northern edge of the Arctic, then walk slowly south, passing through ancient Inuit territories, across the boreal forests, the Great Plains, the deserts and rainforests, and finally into the tip of Patagonia, you'd be walking through one of the strangest blood-type landscapes on Earth. Among many indigenous groups of the Americas, Type O isn't just common, it's almost everything. In some Central and South American populations, 90 to nearly 100% of people are Type O. A, B, and AB barely whisper in the genetic background, if they appear at all. How did that happen? The people who first crossed into the Americas carried only a tiny slice of all the genetic variation that existed back in Eurasia. A small founding population, probably already skewed toward Type O, moved through Siberia during the last ice age and eventually crossed into a new continent that no human had ever seen. Once there, they spread out, filled empty lands, and multiplied. When a founding group is small, chance becomes powerful. Genetic drift. A few early births and deaths, a few fortunate families with Type O children, and suddenly the whole population tips. For thousands of years, indigenous communities in the Americas lived largely isolated from the complex population, mixing happening across Africa, Europe, and Asia. There were no big waves of newcomers carrying high frequencies of A or B to dilute the O dominance. Some researchers think natural selection added a push. In certain environments, O might have been slightly better at helping people survive particular infections. Over long spans of time, even tiny advantages can reshape an entire continent. But the exact details are still debated. What's clear is the outcome. From the Arctic all the way to the Amazon, Type O became the default setting for human blood. The Americas aren't the only place where O looms large. Travel back across the oceans to Africa, the continent where our species first stood upright and tested this blood against a harsh and unpredictable world. In many sub-Saharan populations, Type O is again strongly represented, often reaching high frequencies. But here, the story isn't just history and drift. It's a long, grinding war with one of humanity's oldest enemies, malaria. Certain forms of malaria hit some blood types harder than others. In regions where malaria has been intense for millennia, people with Type O appear, on average, to have a slightly better chance of surviving severe forms of the disease. Not immunity, not protection in any simple sense, but a small statistical edge. Over thousands of years, such an edge means more O-blooded children living long enough to have O-blooded children of their own. So Africa carries deep pockets of high O frequency, not as purely as the Americas, but still unmistakable. An echo of ancient selection pressures layered over the foundational age of the type itself. Push further outward, following the paths of some of the last great human dispersals, into Australia. Across the scattered islands of the Pacific. Here, again, Type O rises. The first Australians arrived tens of thousands of years ago, likely carrying a genetic mix that had already been shaped by earlier bottlenecks and migrations across Asia. Once they reached the continent, isolation did the rest. On an island continent separated by wide seas, with limited gene flow from the outside for most of prehistory, certain variants became dominant. Among many Aboriginal Australian groups, Type O is common, often very common, though not as universally overwhelming as in parts of the Americas. Then there's Polynesia and the wider Pacific. Imagine small groups of seafarers setting out in canoes, crossing vast stretches of open ocean. Every voyage a genetic bottleneck, every island a new experiment in population genetics. You take a few dozen people, maybe less, land them on an isolated island, and let the generations roll. If those founders happen to have high O frequencies, that's what the island will carry, sometimes for thousands of years. Across parts of Polynesia, type O again rises to very high levels. The same pattern we saw in the Americas appears here on a smaller scale. Small founding groups, isolation, and the amplifying power of drift, all conspiring to let the ancient bloodline dominate. Now turn your gaze to Europe, and something more subtle appears. Here, type O doesn't usually reach the near absolute dominance of the Americas or certain island populations. Instead, it forms a gradient, a quiet slope stretching from west to east. In many Western European populations, especially along the Atlantic coast, O stays relatively high. As you move eastward, across Central Europe and toward Russia and Central Asia, the frequencies of A and then B begin to rise, and O gradually becomes less overwhelming. Why a gradient? Because Europe for most of its history wasn't a sealed-off world or a single migration event. It was a crossroads. Hunter-gatherers, Paleolithic Europeans carried their own mix of types, with O likely well represented. Later, Neolithic farmers moved in from the Near East, bringing different genetic profiles with more A. Still later, steppe populations from the east, with higher frequencies of B, swept into Europe during the Bronze Age and after. Layer people on top of people like translucent maps. Western regions, closer to the old Atlantic refuges, and more influenced by early hunter-gatherer ancestry, keep relatively more O. Eastern regions, touched more strongly by waves from Central and Western Asia, carry more A and especially more B. Over thousands of years, the mixing doesn't erase the pattern. It just softens it into a gradient rather than a sharp border. Then there is East Asia, where the picture changes again. If you shift the map to China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, Southeast Asia, you don't see the world of almost all O that you find in the Americas. Instead, you see a more even balance, and in many areas a striking rise in types A and B. Some East Asian populations show some of the highest B frequencies anywhere on Earth. A is strong in many places as well. O is still there, still important, but it no longer rules unchallenged. What carved this pattern? Part of it comes down to different ancestral streams. East Asia was shaped by ancient migrations that diverged early from those that would eventually head toward Europe or the Americas. Over long stretches of time, local selection pressures, diet, pathogens, population density may have nudged certain blood types upward. Farming emerged early and intensively in several East Asian regions, creating dense populations where infectious diseases could spread differently than in scattered hunter-gatherer bands. Some pathogens may have exploited certain blood types more efficiently than others, pushing the frequencies in new directions. There's also the sheer scale and continuity of population. Massive, long-settled societies connected by trade and empire allowed genetic variants like A and B to persist and spread, rather than being lost by chance in small, isolated groups. In a world of millions rather than thousands, drift has a harder time pushing one type to near total dominance. When you step back from the details, the map stops looking random. A pattern emerges. In regions shaped by small founding groups and long isolation, the Indigenous Americas, many Pacific islands, some remote areas, type O often rises to near universality. In regions shaped by deep time, endemic disease, and complex population history, sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Asia, O is strong but woven into a more intricate tapestry. In grand crossroads like Europe and West Asia, no single type wins outright. Instead, we see gradients, blends, and shifting balances reflecting thousands of years of movement and mixing. Geography sets the stage. Oceans, mountains, deserts, and ice lines decide who can meet whom and how often. Migration brings in new variants, or traps old ones on distant shores. History, plagues, farming, empires, collapses, decides which blood types gain small edges and which quietly recede. Yet through all of this, Type O endures, sometimes as a quiet background hum, sometimes as a roar that drowns out everything else. The oldest common blood type didn't fade away as new types emerged. Instead, it threaded itself through every migration, every settlement, every lost and found population on Earth. Look at the global mosaic, and you're really seeing a memory, a faint red-tinged echo of ice ages and land bridges, of canoes and caravans, of cities and plagues and lonely islands lost in blue water. The pattern is uneven, fractured, sometimes puzzling, but at its core, running like a deep current beneath all the later complexity, is that ancient lineage that walked out of Africa and never stopped moving. If you were sitting in a quiet bar in Tokyo right now, or riding a late-night train in Seoul, and you casually mentioned that you're Type O, people wouldn't just hear a medical fact, they'd hear a personality. In parts of East Asia, especially Japan and South Korea, blood type isn't just something on your donor card. It's a kind of folk psychology, a way of guessing who you are before you even open your mouth. Job ads have quietly asked for specific blood types. Dating profiles list them alongside height and hobbies. TV shows joke about them the way people elsewhere joke about star signs. And in that world, Type O comes with a very particular story. Type O, they'll tell you, is the born leader. Confident, strong-willed, calm under pressure, the person who takes charge when everyone else is hesitating. The hunter, not the gatherer. The one with the oldest blood, carrying the rugged, no-nonsense mindset of ancient survivalists. It's a flattering myth if you happen to be Type O. You're supposed to be decisive but generous, ambitious but dependable, the sort of person people naturally follow. If someone in the office is coordinating the project, volunteering to organize the trip or stepping in when there's an emergency, someone will eventually say it. Of course, they're O. These ideas didn't come from our Paleolithic ancestors whispering down the generations. They came from 20th century pop psychology. The blood type personality craze really took off in Japan in the late 1970s, after a series of popular books claimed that your ABO type shaped your temperament. The idea spread into magazines, relationship guides, and eventually television. South Korea picked it up later, folding it into K-pop interviews, webtoons, and dramas. Suddenly, something discovered as a quirk of red blood cell chemistry had turned into a personality horoscope. Type A became the careful, anxious planner. Type B, the creative free spirit, sometimes labelled selfish. Type B, the mysterious, complicated outsider. And Type O, the reliable, big-picture leader. It fits so neatly with the evolutionary story people were already telling themselves. Hunters and warriors must have needed courage and focus, farmers and caretakers, patience and order. If Type O was the original blood type, then surely its personality must be original too. Bold, tough, ready to act. It's a compelling narrative. But does any of it hold up when you put it under the microscope? When psychologists and geneticists have actually tried to test these claims, the results have been underwhelming. Large studies that compare people's self-reported personalities with their ABO blood types generally find no consistent, meaningful correlations. Sometimes a tiny association pops up in one study, only to vanish in another. When those small effects do appear, they're usually so weak that they're essentially useless for predicting how any individual will behave. Part of the problem is expectation. If you grow up in a culture where everyone repeats, again and again, that Type O people are confident and decisive, you might start to see yourself that way. You may even behave that way more often, just to match the story you've internalized. That's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then there's the way our brains handle coincidences. If you meet a confident Type O, the belief feels confirmed. If you meet a shy, uncertain type O, you quietly file them as an exception. You remember the hits, forget the misses, and over time the pattern seems rock solid, even when the data say otherwise. When researchers run blind tests, asking people to guess blood types from personality alone, the accuracy drops to chance. When they control for culture, age, and expectation, the alleged personality signatures almost always dissolve. From the perspective of modern science, there is little, if any, evidence that your ABO type dictates whether you're a leader, a warrior, an artist, or a rebel. So why did this idea become so powerful? Because it scratches a very old itch in the human mind. We are a species that loves categories. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors had to make fast judgments about strangers, friend or threat, ally or rival, trustworthy or dangerous. Putting people into boxes, even imperfect ones, offered a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Astrology did it with the stars. The four humours once did it with bodily fluids. The blood-type personality system does it with red cells and antigens. All of them share a similar logic. They say, beneath the chaos of human behaviour there is a hidden order. If you know the sign, or the humour, or the blood type, you can see the real person underneath. You can explain why they act the way they do. You can predict whether you'll get along, fall in love, or clash. It's comforting. It simplifies a messy reality. Astrology looks up to constellations and planets. Blood-type psychology looks in to molecules swirling through your veins, but in both cases the appeal is the same. Identity becomes something you were born with, something written in the sky or written in your blood, not just a complicated mixture of experiences, choices, and accidents. There's another reason the blood-type myth took hold, especially in Japan and Korea. It arrived at a moment when genetics was moving from the laboratory into everyday life. People were hearing about DNA, heredity, and inborn traits. There was a sense that biology contained secrets about who we really are. Blood types were one of the earliest, simplest genetic systems humans had learned to map. You didn't need a genome sequencer. A basic blood test could tell you something that sounded deep and fundamental. That made them a natural canvas for cultural imagination. If genes matter, then maybe this one matters for more than just transfusions. Maybe it shapes your temperament, your talents, your destiny. Science says no, at least when it comes to personality. But that doesn't mean ABO types are irrelevant. Far from it. The same molecules that inspire pop culture horoscopes actually do influence your life in ways that are quieter, but far more real. Some blood types are more susceptible to particular infections. Others are slightly protected. Type O, for instance, shows associations with certain diseases and resistance patterns that only emerge when you pull data from thousands, sometimes millions of people. Those differences don't turn you into a born leader or a natural introvert. But they might nudge the odds of you getting severe malaria, or a specific kind of ulcer, or a blood clot. They might have shaped which populations thrived in certain environments, and which ones struggled when new pathogens arrived. That's where the real scientific story of blood types lives, in epidemiology, in immunology, in the quiet tug-of-war between human cells and the microscopic world that has been shadowing us since the Savanna. And this is where the myth and the science intersect in a curious way. The cultural story says, type O, people are tough, resilient survivors. Evolutionary and medical research says, type O blood has, in some times and places, carried specific survival advantages and disadvantages against particular diseases. The personality is a projection. The survival patterns are measurable. We invent one to make sense of our daily social world. We uncover the other to make sense of our deep biological past. As we leave the realm of horoscopes and office gossip, the focus shifts. Instead of asking whether type O makes you a natural leader, we begin asking how type O shaped the odds of your ancestors surviving cholera in a river valley. or smallpox in a crowded city, or malaria in a humid lowland. The pop culture fascination with blood-type personalities is like a mirror, reflecting our need to see identity written in something bigger than ourselves. But behind that mirror, there is a far older, quieter drama playing out in the chemistry of your blood. A drama of infections and antibodies, of plagues and migrations, of who lived long enough to have children and who did not. From here, the story turns away from office superstitions and magazine quizzes and back toward the laboratory and the hospital ward. Toward the places where type O blood isn't a personality label, but a critical factor in surgery, trauma care and global health. The myths tell us how we like to imagine ourselves. The science tells us how our ancestors actually survived. And in the space between those two stories, between who we think we are and what our blood has really done, we can start to see type O not as a horoscope, but as an ancient code still shaping modern medicine. Modern hospitals are in some ways just high-tech versions of those ancient camps around a Savanna fire. People are still getting hurt, bodies are still losing blood faster than they can replace it, and survival still depends on whether there's enough of the right kind of blood nearby when disaster strikes. In that world, type O sits at the centre of everything. Inside every emergency room, every trauma bay, there's a quiet hierarchy of blood. Labels, barcodes, expiration dates, all organised in refrigerators that hum like mechanical hearts. And somewhere near the front, usually with bright tags and extra checks, are the type O negative units. Type O negative is called the universal donor, not because it's magically compatible with everyone in every context, but because its red blood cells lack the A and B markers that can trigger violent immune reactions. In a crisis, when doctors don't have time to carefully match every blood group, O negative is the safest bet. Car crash, gunshot wound, postpartum hemorrhage, a child bleeding out on an operating table, when the clock shrinks down to seconds, the question often isn't, what's their blood type? But, do we have O negative in the fridge? It's the blood type that gets thrown into the breach. But there's a catch. O negative is rare. Only a small portion of the global population has it. Yet medical systems treat it like an all-purpose safety net. That mismatch, high demand, low supply, creates a constant quiet pressure. Blood banks live in a permanent state of almost shortage, especially for O. Not just O negative, but O positive too, because type O patients themselves can only receive from their own group, and there are a lot of them. So behind the clean corridors and blinking monitors, there's another story running in parallel. A story of phone calls and text alerts from blood centres, of donor chairs and cookies and nurses who know the regulars by name. Every few weeks, someone with O negative sits down, rolls up a sleeve and gives away half a litre of their ancient bloodline so that some stranger they'll never meet can live. Hospitals manage blood like a perishable currency. Red cells last only a few weeks, platelets just a few days. You can't stockpile for years. You can't manufacture new units out of metal and wires. They have to be grown, molecule by molecule, inside living people. In a world obsessed with digital abundance, blood remains stubbornly analog. That limitation has pushed scientists toward an ambitious idea. What if you could turn other blood types into type O? It sounds like alchemy, but it's based on something simple. The difference between A, B, AB and O isn't some vast chemical gulf. It's sugar decorations on the surface of red blood cells, tiny molecular ornaments that immune systems are very picky about. Type O is the stripped-down version. No A sugar, no B sugar, just the bare scaffold. In research labs, teams have been hunting for enzymes, tiny biological scissors that can snip off those A and B sugars without damaging the cell beneath. If you could do that quickly, safely and cheaply, you could take a bag of A or B blood, run it through a biochemical wash, and end up with something that behaves like O. Some experiments have already shown this is possible in principle. Enzymes harvested from gut bacteria, naturally adapted to chew on similar sugars in food, have been repurposed to trim blood cells. In small tests, they've managed to convert much of the A or B surface markers into the O-like state. It's not perfect yet. There are safety concerns, lingering traces of markers, regulatory hurdles. But the concept is on the table. If it works at scale, it would change hospital medicine forever. Suddenly the bottleneck would ease. The ancient privilege of type O as the universal backup would become a manufactured property, something we could grant to other blood types at will. Instead of praying enough O-negative donors show up this month, blood banks could re-engineer surplus A or B units into universal reserves. In a way, that would be the latest twist in the story of type O, an adaptation so successful that modern science tries to copy it on demand. But modern medicine isn't just interested in who you can donate to. It's also interested in what your blood type might say about your own health. For decades, doctors suspected that ABO blood groups might influence disease risks, not in a destiny sense, not as absolute fate, but as subtle nudges in probability. Large population studies have strengthened that idea. People with type O, for example, often show a slightly lower risk of certain kinds of heart disease and blood clots compared to non-O types. One reason seems to be clotting chemistry. Non-O individuals tend to have higher levels of some clotting factors, like von Willebrand factor and factor VIII. That can be useful, you clot faster, but it may also raise the odds of dangerous blockages in arteries and veins. Type O with lower average levels sits a bit further from that edge. On the other hand, type O isn't protected from everything. Some studies have found that O individuals may have a higher risk of certain types of ulcers and gastrointestinal bleeding, especially in connection with the bacterium Helicobacter pylori. The same traits that nudge clotting one way might influence how blood vessels and mucous membranes behave under stress. In some cancers, like pancreatic or gastric, non-O types sometimes appear at slightly higher risk, but the patterns are complex, the effect size is modest, and environment and lifestyle still do most of the heavy lifting. Think of blood type not as a personal prophecy, but as one thread woven into a much larger health tapestry. It tugs a little here, loosens a little there, but never fully writes the story on its own. Then came COVID-19, and suddenly the world's attention turned to every possible genetic clue that might explain why some people got devastating disease while others had mild symptoms or none at all. In that frantic search, blood type reappeared in the spotlight. Early studies, especially from Europe and China, suggested that type O individuals might be slightly less likely to test positive for SARS-CoV-2, or less likely to develop severe disease compared to some other types, particularly A. The differences were not huge, and later research has been more cautious, but the pattern kept showing up often enough to stay interesting. Why would that be? There are hypotheses, but no unanimous answer. Some scientists point again to clotting. Severe COVID is not just a respiratory illness, it's a vascular and clotting disease too. If non-O types are already sitting closer to a hypercoagulable state, an infection that pushes the system further might tip them into more dangerous territory. Others look at the way natural antibodies against A and B antigens might interact with viral particles, or how blood group markers on cells affect immune signaling. It remains a landscape of maybes and partial explanations, not settled law. But the very fact that researchers turn to ABO genetics so quickly shows how deeply this ancient blood system is embedded in our thinking about disease. As genomic tools become more powerful, blood type is starting to feel less like a simple label and more like one small portal into a vast personal biological map. Future medicine is likely to use that map in ways that feel almost uncanny from today's perspective. Instead of asking only whether you're O, AB or AB, doctors might look at dozens of blood-related markers at once, clotting factors, immune receptor variants, inflammatory pathways, and build a personalized risk profile. Your ancestry, your ancient bottlenecks and migrations, quietly shaping which drugs work best for you, which vaccines you respond strongly to, which diseases you should be screened for earlier or more often. There are already hints of this. Organ transplant matching goes far beyond ABO into tissue compatibility genes. Cancer treatments are tailored to tumor mutations. Pharmacogenetics guides which medications and doses are safest for particular genetic backgrounds. ABO will simply be one coordinate in a growing constellation. At the same time, research continues on ways to step around blood types altogether. Synthetic blood substitutes. Lab-grown red cells produced from stem cells, engineered to carry oxygen efficiently and ignore immune markers entirely. Machines that recycle and clean a patient's own blood during surgery. Each new technology chips away at the fragile dependence on human donors, but none have fully replaced them yet. For now, hospitals still run on the old system, on bags of crimson labelled with letters discovered barely a century ago, carrying molecules that evolved millions of years before anyone named them. And type O, especially O negative, remains the emergency key tucked under the mat, pulled out when there's no time, no margin, no second chance. When you lie down to sleep, your heart moves that ancient blood through your arteries in quiet loops, just as it did for your ancestors who crossed deserts and ice fields. Tomorrow, somewhere, that same chemical signature may determine which unit of blood is hung on a trauma rack, which therapy a researcher tests in a lab, which statistical curve bends slightly towards survival. Modern medicine speaks in the language of codes and protocols, but underneath it's still working with the same elemental substance. The old river, the ancient red, flowing from the Savanna to the ICU, from prehistoric survival to personalized genomics. And type O, the stripped-down blood, keeps doing what it has always done, carrying oxygen, carrying history, carrying possibility through yet another chapter of the human story. By now, the story has stretched from tiny bands on an African savanna to whole continents, ice ages, plagues, and empires. But there's a question modern minds can't resist asking. If blood type O is this old, this deeply woven into human survival, who had it? Not just in a statistical sense, but in a personal one. Did pharaohs carry it? Emperors? Saints? Conquerors? Here the story suddenly becomes foggy, because for almost all of human history, nobody even knew blood types existed. For most famous figures, their blood type is like their first spoken word or their favourite childhood meal. Lost, not because it never existed, but because no one thought to write it down. The ABO system wasn't discovered until the early 1900s. Before that, blood was just blood. Red, warm, sometimes life-saving in ritual, often deadly when transfused. So when we ask, was Julius Caesar type O? Was Cleopatra? Was Genghis Khan? We're really asking the past to answer a question it never heard. That doesn't mean we know nothing. It just means we need to be humble, careful. We have to work with fragments, bone dust, scraps of tissue, dried stains that have survived longer than most nations. In a few cases, those fragments have spoken. Genetic testing has revealed the blood types of some well-preserved remains. One of the most famous is the Iceman from the Alps, Ötzi, who died more than 5,000 years ago on a glacier between what is now Italy and Austria. His body froze where he fell, and for millennia he slept under ice. When scientists finally examined his DNA, they found that Ötzi carried blood group O. A Bronze Age wanderer, armed with a copper axe and grass-stuffed shoes, walking through a world that still remembered the last ice age. His blood type links him directly to that older survival story. A type O body moving through a landscape shaped by bottlenecks and glaciations. Other ancient remains tell similar, if quieter, stories. Some Egyptian mummies, when tested, appear to show blood group O as well. The data are limited, often contested, and the methods are tricky. Ancient DNA is fragile, easily contaminated, and blood group genes are only tiny threads in a much larger genetic tapestry. Still, the pattern is clear enough to be intriguing. Type O has been flowing through human veins since long before modern borders, long before modern languages, long before anyone dreamed of pharaohs or pyramids. But then we reach one of the strangest and most debated artifacts in religious and scientific history, the Shroud of Turin. The shroud is a linen cloth bearing the faint image of a man, front and back, as if a body had been wrapped inside it and somehow left a ghostly photographic negative behind. For centuries, many have believed it to be the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth. Others see it as a medieval forgery, an ingenious artwork created when Europe was full of relics, some authentic, many not. From a blood type perspective, the shroud is fascinating because of one simple claim. Several studies have suggested that the stains on it, interpreted as blood, are type AB, not O. AB is rare today, and likely arose long after the earliest expansions of our species. If those tests are accurate, and if the stains are truly ancient blood, that would tell us something specific. Whoever bled on that cloth was not type O. But every part of that statement carries uncertainty. The age of the cloth, the authenticity of the blood, the reliability of serological tests on centuries-old material, the risk of contamination from generations of handling, candles, smoke, restorations. None of these are trivial. Radiocarbon dating has suggested a medieval origin for the linen, though that too is debated with arguments about sample choice, fire damage and repairs. So the shroud doesn't really tell us whether a specific famous figure was type O. Instead, it tells us something more philosophical. Even when we hold an object that people have venerated for hundreds of years, an object drenched in story and faith, the biological truth beneath it remains elusive. We can test, argue, reinterpret, but certainty slips away. The deeper we peer into the past, the more we are reminded that our desire for clear answers often outruns the evidence. The same is true when we turn to royal bloodlines. When people hear bloodline, they often think of kings and queens, dynasties and heraldry, coats of arms and golden crowns. But royal bloodlines were tracked for inheritance, not immunology. Medieval scribes recorded who married whom, who was legitimate, who had a claim to land and titles. They didn't record ABO blood types. They couldn't. Modern medicine has occasionally peeked into royal graves. A few European royal families in the 19th and 20th centuries had their blood types documented in hospital records and medical archives. Some royals were type O, some A, some B, some AB, much like any large family. A Japanese emperor here, a European monarch there. These isolated data points are interesting, but they're tiny islands in a vast ocean of unrecorded history. People sometimes speculate that particular traits associated with type O today, like lower susceptibility to certain infections or a different clotting profile, might have helped some royal line survive plagues or battlefield wounds. It's an appealing story, a hidden biological advantage flowing quietly under the surface of politics and war. It might even be partially true in some cases. But the evidence is thin. History is messy, shaped by accidents, alliances, betrayals, geography, and sheer chance. Blood type is just one thread in a tapestry too complex to unwind with simple explanations. So when you see long lists online of famous type O people claiming that this leader, that artist, that scientist definitely had blood group O, remember how little hard data we actually have. For most pre-modern individuals, unless their remains have been carefully analysed with modern genetics, their blood type is simply unknown. Any confident statement beyond that is more wish than fact. And yet, even with all that uncertainty, there is something quietly profound here. Because statistically we know that countless famous figures must have been type O, the hunters who first crossed into the Americas, the nameless innovators who tamed fire, perfected stone tools, learned to shape metal, the explorers who followed coastlines no one had mapped, the healers who found herbs that soothed fevers, the storytellers who kept memories alive through long winters. Most of them are invisible to our written histories, but they were real, and many of them carried the same blood type you might have now. Think of one figure whose blood type we don't know, but whose story we do. A scribe in ancient Mesopotamia, scratching the first wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. A sailor in the Indian Ocean, steering by stars and swells. A builder hauling stones for a temple that still stands. Some of them were A, some B, some AB. Many were O. You will never learn their names, but your immune system carries echoes of the world they faced. Modern type O individuals, famous or unknown, are not outsiders or anomalies. They're part of an ancient river that runs beneath every civilization. Today, we can list a few confirmed or highly probable type O personalities from the era of blood tests, certain presidents, athletes, performers, scientists. Their charts say O+ or O- in a hospital file, the way yours might. But what matters more than their fame is the pattern they share with millions of strangers. Because if you are type O, you don't just connect to a handful of notable names. You connect to something deeper than any royal pedigree. You connect to the 1,280 survivors and the thousands who followed. To hunters under auroras and farmers under monsoon skies. To Ötzi on his mountain pass, and to unknown mummies wrapped against desert air. To lineages that never wrote histories but lived them. Your blood type is not destiny. It does not dictate your personality, your success, your worth, but it is a trace, a faint but continuous line, linking your quiet, sleeping body to almost unimaginable stretches of time. When you think about famous figures and ancient rulers, remember that their stories are only the visible peaks. Beneath them lies a vast landscape of ordinary lives, all of them carrying the same old genes that survived the bottleneck. If your blood is type O, you are part of that landscape, part of the oldest branch of the ABO tree that we know, not a separate class of person, not a chosen group, but one manifestation of a shared human inheritance that began long before cities, long before writing, long before anyone thought to wonder what kind of blood flowed in a king's veins. And as history moves forward, the names we consider famous will change. New figures will rise, old ones will fade, but the ancient O lineage will keep travelling quietly through time, from parent to child, from one ordinary life to the next, carrying memories of deserts, ice sheets, and savannas, written not in books, but in the code of your own cells. So where does all of this leave type O now, in the strange bright flicker of the modern world? If you could step back and look at the planet the way a geneticist does, not as a map of countries but as a moving sea of alleles, you'd see something striking. Those ancient survival genes, the ones that rode out droughts and glaciers and famines, are still here. But they aren't sitting still. They're flowing. For most of human history, blood type patterns were patchy and local. Type O dominated in the Americas, was common across Africa, and shared space with A and B in Europe and Asia. Populations were separated by deserts, oceans, mountain ranges, and the simple reality that walking is slow. If you were born in a village, you probably married in that village or the next one over. The frequencies of O, A, B, and AB in each region drifted slowly, nudged by disease, diet, and chance. Now think about the last 100 years. Airplanes, cargo ships, highways, global cities. Millions of people moving every day, crossing oceans in hours instead of generations. From a blood type's point of view, this is chaos, in the best possible way. In a single apartment building in London or São Paulo or Sydney, you can have descendants of hunter-gatherers from the Amazon, rice farmers from East Asia, herders from East Africa, and medieval peasants from Europe all sharing elevators and Wi-Fi. They meet, they fall in love, they have children, and those children carry gene combinations that never existed before in the entire history of life. This is changing blood type frequencies right now, in real time. Regions that were once almost pure type O are now beginning to see more A and B. Places that were once dominated by A are getting an influx of O from migration and intermarriage. In some big multicultural cities, you can already see blood type distribution smoothing out, drifting toward a kind of global average. Not everywhere, and not perfectly, but the edges are blurring. Type O, though, still has a head start. It remains the single most common blood type worldwide. A quiet majority in the global gene pool. Every time people from different backgrounds have children, there's a good chance that O sneaks through, carried silently from both sides. Because O is recessive at the ABO locus, it can hide in people who are A or B on the surface, waiting for two carriers to meet. Then, suddenly, an O child appears, another echo of that ancient bloodline rising in a new century. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. For hundreds of thousands of years, the survival of a blood type depended on the brutal math of biology. If you had the wrong antigens in the wrong epidemic, you died more often. If you had a helpful variant for a local disease, you left more children. Simple, ruthless selection. Now, humans are starting to cheat. Imagine a future hospital. A patient rolls in after an accident. Their blood type is unknown. A machine reads a drop of blood, matches their immune profile in seconds, and a bag of perfectly compatible red cells is printed, grown, or synthesized on demand. No donor, no waiting, just custom-made blood. Researchers are already working on this. Some are trying to grow red blood cells from stem cells in bioreactors. Others are experimenting with universal synthetic blood products that can carry oxygen without triggering dangerous immune reactions. There are even projects looking at enzymes that could strip A or B antigens off donor blood, converting it into something more like type O. If any of this becomes routine, it would change transfusion medicine completely. Blood banks might not need to stockpile and sort donations in the same way. Emergency rooms might not panic when the supply of O-negative runs low. The practical advantage that made type O the universal donor in modern hospitals could fade. So what happens to an ancient bloodline when technology starts to bypass the rules that helped shape it? On the surface, not much. Your ABO type is just one tiny part of your genome. Even if future medicine makes blood type irrelevant for transfusions, it won't erase the genes themselves. They'll still be passed down, shuffled through generations like all the others. Type O won't disappear overnight because of synthetic blood, any more than blue eyes vanished when we invented sunglasses. But the pressures on blood types might change. For most of history, infectious disease has been one of the primary forces nudging ABO frequencies. Certain types seem to fare slightly better against particular pathogens. In some cholera outbreaks, for example, type O has been hit harder. In other diseases, O may have a modest advantage. The pattern is complicated, messy, and still being studied. But the basic idea is clear. Different environments, different microbes, different winners. Now fast forward 1,000 years in your mind. If medicine continues to improve, if antibiotics, vaccines and public health measures keep pushing back against infectious diseases, one of the main historical drivers of ABO evolution could weaken. Selection might shift toward other traits: metabolism, brain function, fertility, resistance to chronic illnesses. Blood type could become more of a genetic passenger, shaped more by drift and mixing than by the sharp edge of survival. Or new pressures could appear. Climate change might alter disease landscapes in ways we can't predict. Urbanization can create dense networks where certain pathogens thrive, and subtle differences in immune response might matter again. Emerging viruses could interact with ABO antigens in unexpected ways. In those scenarios, the ancient dance between blood types and disease could take new steps, with new winners and losers. There's another layer too, one that's quieter but just as real. Social evolution. As people from every corner of the world continue to mix, the old geographic patterns of blood type keep dissolving. Your ABO type will say less and less about where your ancestors came from in the last few thousand years. Instead, it will reflect a deep blended human history, a global story rather than a local one. Type O's future may be less about specific regions and more about its role as a shared inheritance across populations. And this is where you come back into the story. If you are Type O, your veins carry a direct line back to those early African survivors, the people who endured droughts and famines and long nights of fear, who learned to cooperate, to share food, to tell stories. Every beat of your heart pushes that ancient chemistry through a thoroughly modern body, one that rides in airplanes, stares at screens, and worries about emails instead of saber-toothed cats. You are living proof that their strategy worked. They gambled on cooperation, on intelligence, on the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. They survived ice ages and migrations, plagues and wars, the rise of agriculture, the birth of cities, the shock of industry. Their blood learned to coexist with parasites, to navigate new diets, to thread the needle of survival again and again. That same system is humming along quietly inside you right now, doing its job so well you rarely think about it. And if you aren't Type O, you're still part of this story. The ancient O lineage sits in the background of your genome too, braided together with A and B in ways that go back to those same bottlenecks and migrations. Somewhere in your family tree, O ancestors walked across savannas and ice, crossed land bridges and oceans, and handed their genes to people who eventually handed them to you. So when you hear that Type O is the oldest bloodline, try not to imagine a museum piece trapped in the past. Picture instead a river that started in a tiny spring almost 1 million years ago, was forced through a narrow canyon by climate disaster, then burst out onto a widening plain. That river now runs through billions of bodies, mixing, dividing, shifting course, but always flowing forward. In the centuries to come, synthetic blood and precision medicine may change how we think about transfusions. Global migration will keep scrambling regional patterns. New diseases and new environments will continue to test the limits of our biology. Through all of it, Type O will keep doing what it has always done, circulating quietly, adapting subtly, surviving. If you listen closely, beneath the hum of modern life, you can almost hear it. The slow, steady pulse of an ancient bloodline, still moving, still searching for its place in a future it could never have imagined. So now, when you think about blood Type O, you're not just thinking about a letter on a lab report. You're thinking about a thread that runs all the way back through that bottleneck, through the savannas and the ice, through hunters watching the horizon and gatherers reading the seasons in the wind. You're thinking about a code that learned to survive droughts, plagues, famines, and migrations so vast we can barely imagine them. Type O is often described as the oldest blood group, not because we can point to a single moment when it appeared, but because when we trace human lineages back, again and again we keep finding it there, in the camps of early Homo sapiens in Africa, in the shadows of Neanderthal-haunted valleys, in the canoes crossing into the Americas, in the bodies of people who never knew each other, never spoke the same language, never saw the same stars, but carried the same invisible signature in their veins. But the quiet truth is this: whether you're Type O, AB, or AB, your blood is ancient. Every type was shaped by the same long story of drought and recovery, of migrations and meetings, of love, birth, and loss repeated over hundreds of thousands of years. Blood type is not a marker of superiority. It is not a destiny. It is a set of tiny biochemical differences that tell us how our ancestors met their environments and survived. When we look at type O, we see one strategy, a pattern that may have helped early humans face parasites, bacterial infections, and the brutal randomness of life on the move. When we look at the other types, we see counter-strategies, trade-offs that became useful in different landscapes, under different diseases, in crowded villages and walled cities. Together they form a mosaic of adaptation, a reminder that diversity itself is the real survival trait. So as you lie here, listening, you can imagine that ancient bottleneck again. A world nearly empty of humans, a few scattered families watching the sky for rain, counting every mouthful of food, telling stories around tiny fires, not knowing if their line would continue. They had no idea that, almost 1,000,000 years later, their descendants would number in the billions, that their blood, reshaped and recombined 1,000 times over, would be typing itself into digital comment sections across the planet. Every beat of your heart is part of that continuity. Whatever your blood type, you are carrying an unbroken chain of survival that stretches back far beyond written history, back before cities, before agriculture, before the first carved symbol or painted wall. Your body remembers things your mind never learned, pathogens faced, climates endured, foods digested, losses overcome. Blood typing lets us glimpse a tiny part of that memory. It reminds us that the borders we draw between countries, cultures, and eras are recent, fragile, and often misleading. Someone listening to this in Tokyo or Lagos or Sao Paulo, or a small town no one's ever heard of, may share more in common with you at the level of their red blood cells than with their own next-door neighbour. Under the surface, we are all experiments run by the same ancient process, all different, all related. If this journey through time kept you company tonight, if it helped you drift a little closer to sleep while your mind wandered across epochs and continents, you're very welcome to support the channel in the simplest ways. You can tap like, so the algorithm knows you enjoyed the story. You can subscribe, so you don't miss the next voyage into deep history. And if you feel like adding your own small note to this long human record, you can share in the comments where you're listening from, your city, your country, or just from the dark under a warm blanket. It's always fascinating to see how many corners of the world are quietly connected here at the same moment in time. For those who want to go a step further, there's also an optional membership here on YouTube. It's never expected but always appreciated. It helps us research, write, and record more of these long, gentle dives into the past. If that's something you'd like to be part of, you can join whenever it feels right. If not, your presence, your curiosity, and your quiet attention are already more than enough. As the episode comes to an end, you can let the details of blood groups and bottlenecks fade into the background. What remains is the feeling that you are not an isolated moment, but a moving point on a very long line. A carrier of an ancient code passed from firelit nights to flickering screens, from stone tools to streaming data. Your heart will go on beating while you sleep tonight, tirelessly repeating what it has done since long before there were names for any of this. And somewhere in that steady rhythm is the soft echo of those first survivors who refused to let the story end.